Hey, Snackers, Matt DiNapoli here. I'm the head of developer strategy with Cisco DevNet.
Hello, Snackers. This is Kareem Iskander. I'm a lead technical advocate with Cisco Learning and Certifications.
Episode 120 of Snack Minute.
Snack Minute is your weekly 10-minute bite of learning covering tech, coding, and some cool projects that we work on.
And the cool thing we're going to be talking about today is kind of an underrated topic, and it's more about error handling and rate limiting, addressing rate limiting in APIs. With us today, we have Shweta to talk about some best practices and efficiencies around using Meraki APIs. And I think she'll have some other little tidbits to tell us when we dig into it. So Shweta, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Shweta and I'm from Meraki Product Management Team. And I'm here today to share some insights about how you can best use your Meraki APIs, how not to get rate limited, and how to gracefully handle that rate limit. And also some best practices around picking some more efficient API endpoints over the least efficient ones pertaining to your particular use cases.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Right.
So Kareem and I are real familiar with the Meraki APIs. We've been working with them since Cisco bought Meraki, and we've definitely hit the point where we've gotten that error that said you've made too many API calls. And I'll tell you what, probably the biggest support ticket that we've ever had to address is how do I make sure I address the rate limit that's on those. And so, it's exciting to have you on here to talk about, some of the best practices around that, because there's no better person to talk about it than you.
And we can have this conversation in like 10 seconds and just say, use the SDK, it handles it for you, and then job's done.
I mean, that's part of it, but it's also helpful, in talking about the security piece before, Kareem, I think it's helpful in understanding what API calls are being made.
And it's
I'm going
helpful to know what goes underneath this SDK that you're using. So it's totally valid conversation.
Yeah. So Shweta, if you wouldn't mind diving into what you want to show us.
Sure. Yeah. And, as Kareem said, we can just dive into the SDK and then solve our rate limit problem. But that will actually take care of that problem most of the times. But there are times when even the SDK won't really help, and you'll still keep on encountering the 429s, and you'll be sitting there scratching your head. What do I do now? I don't understand. So rate limiting or 429s, getting those sort of errors are not the only problem. You might also have to check your code and make sure that you are calling the efficient API endpoints, and that you're not wasting your coding logic in parsing huge chunks of data or response bodies when in general you are just interested in specific pieces or small chunks of data. So what I want to do in this episode today is I want to talk about some best practices on how to not get rate limited, and then we will also kind of look into what are some API endpoints which you can use more efficiently. More specifically, what are some organization-wide API endpoints which you can use rather than the device level or network level endpoints. So with that, first of all, just to give some background, Meraki has an API rate limit budget of 10 requests per second, regardless of any number of API applications that is interacting with your organization. So if you exceed that 10 requests per second, you will receive an error code of 429, and you'll probably receive a response body saying that, hey, your request call has been exceeded, and they will give you back a response header. Now, one of the best ways to tackle is look at the response header. There will be a field called try after and the number of seconds that is mentioned in the header, and you can wait for that amount of time and then make another API request. Or the best way you can do is you can also use our Python SDK. So Python SDK for Meraki, we have an officially supported Python SDK, and it will also make sure that it handles rate limit itself in the library, so you don't have to take care about handling the rate limit and then retrying after a certain amount of time. It will just do that for you. So you can check the official Meraki Python library over here, and just I think this is one of the best ways. But now let's say this is more of a reactive way, like you encountered an error and then what you should do now. But let's talk about some more proactive measures, like how in the first place you can just prevent from getting rate limited. So now let's start with monitoring. Whenever you're using an API or automation in a code, you might do two things. First is monitoring, and second is if you want to configure your network or you want to provision your network. So when we talk about monitoring, monitoring is more about making GET requests. You use a lot of GET endpoints to just get tons and tons of data, and you want to be able to monitor your devices if they are online or offline. You want to see if there has been any changes in your organization, how a particular network is doing, and so on. When you are building use cases or writing code for such type of use cases, you should make sure that you strategize your data polling. And by strategizing your data polling means that you are not calling an API endpoint more than what it's actually required. So for example, one thing I can give is, let's say you're making an API call to get a list of organizations or get a list of networks. Now, this type of data is such that it's not going to change every 10 minutes or even every day. So there is really no sense in calling this API endpoint again and again just to make sure that the networks or organizations are in safe. Of course, if the nature of your infrastructure is such that you know that there has been some change in the networks or orgs, then it makes sense. But otherwise, just wasting your API budget on these type of unnecessary calls is just kind of eating into your budget. So you can take care of those issues. Then the other one I can think of is monitoring or your device availability, right? So for example, let's say that you want to see which devices are online and if you want to get alerted whenever any device goes offline. So we have some really good endpoints for that. One is the Get Organization Device Availabilities endpoints. So I can pull this up right here and you can see that the Get Organization Device Availability endpoints will give you a complete list of the availability information for the devices. And one thing I want to call out here is in the description itself, we say that this endpoint is updated every 5 minutes. So now you know that this endpoint will only get reflected with the new changes every 5 minutes. So there's really no point in polling for this endpoint less than 5 minutes because you're going to get the same data. So you're essentially polling for the same duplicate data if you're polling it every 5 minutes, and which in addition will just eat into your API budget. So one thing, make sure that just check that how often the value is being updated so that you are not just polling for stale data all the time. So let's say the Get Organization Device Availability is something which might give you a response like saying that, okay, my device is online, and it helps you to verify the serial number, the status, the tags, and whatnot. Then you might also use the Get Organization Device Statuses endpoint to just poll for all the devices. Let's say you have 20,000, 30,000 devices in your org. It will just give you a whole list of each and every Meraki device, and then it will tell you if it's online or offline and other related fields.
Isn't there also a webhook that you could attach to the other way to get the status of your devices? If a device goes down, it'll send you an event, or am I making this up?
No, that's right. We do have webhooks, and that was actually the second option, which I was gonna touch base on, is that you don't have to just rely on API endpoints,
Sorry.
but you can make use of webhooks. No, that's fine. But the point I'm actually getting here is that you see that these API endpoints, when you poll them, if you have, let's say, more than 5,000 or 10,000 devices in your org, imagine the amount of response body that you're getting in each single API call. So initially, let's say when your network is deployed and you just do this, call these endpoints, let's say once a day. After that, if you want to check for the online or offline status every 5 to 10 minutes, it's really inefficient to keep polling the same devices and get like a huge load of responses. So for that, I'm really excited to share this particular endpoint, which we recently released. It's called the Get Organization Device Availability Change History. What this API endpoint will do is it will just give you the change history of the devices in your org. So from the 20,000 devices in your org, if there are only 20 devices that had some type of change in the last 15 or 20 minutes, it will just give you the old and the newer values of only those 20 changed devices. And it will not give you the whole bunch of 20,000 devices list, which then you again have to go line by line and parse out. So, and if there has been no change in your environment, it will simply give you a null array. So imagine, like, this makes your code so efficient that you're not polling for a huge amount of response again and again. You're just using, maybe at the start, you can have a full overview, a detailed response, and then you just polling for the change history just to make sure that there hasn't been any changes in the devices since the last time you checked. So this really brings up your, I would say, code efficiency. And this is just one example. There are some other examples, like, for example, if you are interested in getting getting a list of uplink information or IP addresses for your device, we have an org-wide API call for that. For example, this one, Get Organization Device Uplinks addresses by device. It's an org-wide. It will give you the list of everything in your org. So this is way more efficient than polling single device, like making 200 per device API calls and then parsing into each of the response body. So the just getting one API call versus 200 or more than that, it's way more efficient. So this applies to a lot of things. You're interested in retrieving a network topology information, or you're interested in retrieving hardware device details. Always make sure that you're checking that there is an org-wide endpoint, which will suffice your need. If you want to rather go device by device, or if you want to go for a whole network or for a whole organization. And so this was the monitoring aspect. And as Kareem said, right, webhooks, that's the way to go. If you just want to be alerted, then explore webhooks. You don't really want to keep polling for API endpoints. Just make webhooks do the work for you. Webhooks will call you whenever there is an alert which you're interested in knowing about.
But I will note, setting up a webhook receiver actually offers the opportunity for security holes as well. Because now we have to have a web server that's behind our firewall that is access controlled. And there's an opportunity there potentially for another vector of attack. So just tying it back to the security conversation from earlier, and that we're in Cybersecurity Awareness Month.
You're
that
so
being
smart,
said,
Matt.
I just, there are ways to harden it and securitize it. And so I'm not saying it's not a good idea. But I could see scenarios where some organizations would say, we don't really want to have that service running, and we would rather a polling situation, and that would potentially make sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And the one thing that I'd like to add too is, as Shweta's talking about all of this and talking about rate limits, you take that for granted. In production, you're going to hit a snag, you're going to hit a rate limit. Chances are you're going to hit a rate limit, especially if you're managing a huge organization, right? And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about when we were talking about putting the DevCore certification together, Matt. And one of the hottest topics that we were talking about is like rate limits. Why do we need to validate how folks know how to handle the rate limit? It's because of this, because situations like this. So not only did we tie it with cybersecurity, we also tied it to certification. So
right, there you go, boom. Drop the mic.
Yeah.
Shweta, I believe there was one more topic you wanted to cover before we call it time. Do you want to touch on that real quick before we wrap up?
The other thing I want to talk about is troubleshooting. So a lot of times our customers say that we are receiving rate limit errors and we are making very less API calls, so we don't know why this is happening. They'll say that we are not consuming the budget, still we are getting rate limited. Why is that? So oftentimes, and I call this like the ghost scripts, there are ghost scripts lying around in your organization or in your applications which unknowingly are making API calls. These might be scripts that someone else in your team might have developed, and now they are no longer part of the team, and they are just lying there making API calls, and you have no clue that this is happening, and which is why you're getting rate limited. So in order to make sure that you know what API calls are being made in your organization, we have some troubleshooting APIs for that. For example, there is an API call. Let's say if you just search for API request, you will get these 3 different API calls, which will essentially give you a highlight of all the API requests over your response codes and all the requests that have been made by your organization. I would say highly recommend that you audit the API request activity for your given organization to understand that if you're sharing the budget with any other applications and if there are scripts which have no maintenance and are degrading the performance of your organization's API budget.
And that is a direct correlation to security creep. So there you go.
and it's called a ghost script, and therefore we're tying it to October because it's spooky.
Spooky. Shweta, unfortunately, that is all the time we have. But before we let you go, since it is your first time, we will ask you, what superpower do you wish you had and why?
I want to say time travel because it's super practical, right? But if I had just 1 second guess, I'm going to say shape shifting. Might be.
So she'd rather not create a paradox, but she would rather be a paradox. I like that. Good choice, Shweta. Snackers, join us next week where we'll cover yet another security topic in this spooky month of October. And we'll see everyone next week. Thank you so much, Shweta, for showing us the best ways to manage our API rate limits.